Well, welcome everyone to the How to Place a Bid webinar for our upcoming spectrum lease auction. Before we get going, and Andreas Bitsarakis, who has just joined us, will be conducting the majority of the webinar, I do want to announce and make some description of our extra read all about it news. So this is something we've been waiting for in the 2.5 gigahertz community for many years. We now have an informal proposal, and soon the FCC will vote to start the formal process called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which can make available the additional EBS spectrum licenses that cover a total of about half of the geography of the country and something like 10% of the population of the country. And so this is, I think, very good news that this process is moving. And we are optimistic that in the end, the FCC will issue rules that are very positive for EBS. But after I give that brief description, then Andreas will give a more complete description of the process of identifying licenses that you can bid on, assessing the value of those licenses, and actually placing a bid so that everyone will be ready for the lease auction with bids due on the end of the day, actually 11 p.m. Eastern on this Thursday. So to move forward on the actual description of the FCC EBS, Educational Broadband Service, NPRM, which is a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, we expect the FCC to approve the rulemaking process on on its May 10th meeting, and then we'll have comments and reply comments. My hope and expectation is that this could be resolved this year. We'll see whether that will happen or not, but the summer could be a very active time in terms of the comments going into the FCC. The first step in this will be the expansion of existing licenses. In many cases, existing licenses have gaps between them. So this is positive for the existing license holders, and it's positive for all of the parties that lease those licenses so to those commercial operators. There may be some renegotiation of leases to accomplish this, and but in general, many of the leases already provide that if the license expands, the commercial operator is allowed to use the expanded area. As I mentioned, this has actually been pending for a long period of time at the FCC. It goes back in some ways all the way back to the 2005 timeframe when the FCC changed the rules, and then more recently to 2008 when the FCC invited some suggestions on how to allocate licenses. And over half of the country geography has open areas where there's no EBS license. So finally, now after some pressure from Select Spectrum and from some commercial operators that we work with, some schools as well, the FCC has come out with a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that basically lays out how they would allow the rest of the country, where there are no existing 2.5 gigahertz EBS licenses or where there's gaps, to be filled out. And we think obviously to get that done is going to be a huge benefit to commercial operators and to this band in general, and also to educators who have not previously had the advantage of these licenses. So it would be essentially a three-step process. The first would be existing license holders could apply. Sounds in this proposal, they'd have to apply to expand their license. There's a variety of options that the FCC lays out there on how those would expand. But the general concept is to fill in relatively small areas between existing licenses that are currently not allocated, and therefore no transmissions are allowed in those areas. Then the next step would be a chance for tribes in rural areas, not necessarily in urban areas according to the NPRM as it's drafted, to apply for licenses covering their areas. And potentially they could apply for all of the vacant channels, the way I see it. So there's a proposal there for comments that that they would be allowed to, if there was 100 megahertz, they could apply for all of it. And finally, the third step in this opening for application is that educators would be allowed to apply for licenses where they have a local presence. And this is really opened up not necessarily to all educators, but only to those educators who've not previously had an EBS license. So that's the three-step process. Once they go all the way through that, if there are areas where there are no applications, they would be opened up to a bidding process with commercial operators being allowed to bid and to acquire the licenses. And interestingly, if there were no applications for a license, it could be auctioned. And if there were competing applications for a license, it could be auctioned. It goes back to the existing statute that basically provides that for a wide variety of license bands, including the 2.5 gigahertz and sort of unfortunately and perhaps mistakenly including the EBS band, if there's competing applications, then auction is what the FCC is directed to do. You may recall, if you looked at the FCC's the prior consensus proposal to the FCC, which was authored by the National EBS Association, the Catholic Telecommunications Network, and WCAI, which is the Wireless Communications Association, and represents commercial licensees. The proposal was that this would essentially be a first come, first serve, and essentially competing applications would not be possible because as soon as a valid application was received in a particular location, the window would close down. There wouldn't be a time for a second application. So I think this is, by the way, one of the areas where the current NPRM is perhaps a bit flawed. I don't think it's realistic to assume that there won't be, in some cases, competing applications. And in that case, if there are competing applications, essentially it could get pulled out of the hands of the local educators and potentially out of the hands of smaller companies that might not be able to afford to bid in an FCC auction for a license. So if we can go forward, here's my predictions based on a very brief review of the notice of proposed rulemaking. I think, first of all, there is a proposal in there to essentially take away the educational reservation. As it is now, educators are allowed to lease the license, but it can't be held by a commercial entity, and 5% has to be reserved for educational use. So I expect many educators will object to that, even though it gives them a chance to sell their license. It really, in the long run, I think takes the majority of the educational benefit out of this band. I do expect competing applications. I think that these are valuable licenses that can provide excellent service in urban and rural areas, and there will be demand for them, and there will be parties, including Select Spectrum, frankly, that will be advocating that educators apply for them. So the news will get out, and under this situation, I think we'll have competing applications, and the result under this proposal would be that things would go to auction. But I do think ultimately this is going to be increased value in the band for whoever ends up holding the licenses, and for the operators. This finishes the national coverage. So the band's been successful without full national coverage. Will be much more successful with full national coverage. And I think that if done right, this provides a lot of openings for fixed wireless operators in smaller rural communities. So in my view, all of that is positive for those of you who are ready to bid